Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and good morning. This is Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis calling you to the discussion on Belarus future scenarios. I am Virginia Budienė, the director of the Institute, and I'm honored to have such distinguished guests today in our discussion. I'm saying good morning because one of our panelists joins us from New York, so they are early in the morning now. I would like to ask Jovita Neliupšienė, the Chancellor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, to moderate the discussion. So congratulations to all joining the discussion, panelists and participants from the other side of the computer screen. And Jovita, I pass now the word to you.
Thank you, Virginia. Hello to everyone. It's a great pleasure to have all the panelists, the distinguished panelists on this discussion. And I think that it's a very symbolic day today, because today the world celebrates Human Rights Days. It's a Universal Human Rights Day. It's 2 days ago, EU actually passed the law on human rights sanctions mechanism. So-called Magnitsky law was approved. I think that it's really a good occasion to look on what's happening in Belarus, and not only to discuss the changes, atrocities of the regime, what we see now already more than 100 days happening in Belarus, but as well to discuss what kind of scenarios, what are the possible developments in our neighboring country. I can rest assured that all Lithuanians actually are following events in our neighboring country, and we, with our really wholeheartedly hoping that democracy, human rights, and rule of law will prevail there. But without other delay, I'd like to welcome our participants, our panelists in this discussion. We have two of them, Siarhei Kharytonau. He's the author of policy paper, The Impact of Global Actors on Political Crisis in Belarus, and Alexander Dabravolski, who is a senior political advisor to Sviatlanos Cichanouskajos, member of the Coordination Council for the Transfer of Powers in Belarus, and as well one of the author of the scenarios, what can happen in Belarus in the nearest future. I'd like to ask our panelists to give us a presentation of their vision and their imagined scenarios. Please, we will start with Siarhei Kharytonau, but please, dear panelists, be so kind. Their first introductory remarks and presentations not longer than 15 minutes. Then we will follow by, well, as the chairing the discussion, I will abuse my powers, and I will ask one or two questions, and then we will have, I hope, we will have the questions from our audience. Dear audience, which, well, still difficult to discuss, to have a discussion without seeing people and without seeing the eyes of the listeners. But please put your questions in the chat, so we can put them for the panelists and have a proper and lively discussion. Please, Siarhei, could you introduce your paper focusing on the global actors and scenarios? What could be what we could see in Belarus?
Thank you, Chancellor. First and foremost, before we jump to the paper itself, I would like to thank Lithuania for all the efforts that this country does to support the people of Belarus. And coming back to the main topic of today's discussion, I would like to say that the findings of the paper and the recommendations of this policy paper are to a great extent based on the findings and the work of myself and my colleagues from International Strategic Action Network for Security, better known as ISANS. And first and foremost, one has to realize that the events happening in Belarus today are not just another protest that has been happening in Belarus on different occasions in the last 26 years. We are witnessing a change, which is a change similar to what was happening to the Baltic countries in the late 80s and early 90s. So in the very nature of the situation that we observe, it is already clear that Alexander Lukashenko is not anymore a legitimate nor a legal head of the Belarusian state, which was clearly mentioned by Lithuania, many European countries, etc. Sviatlana Cichanouskajos, who is regarded as a legitimate and legal leader of Belarus and legal representative of this country, made a clear statement that she is ready to run the transition government of Belarus, which to a great extent shifted the findings of that paper that I prepared previously. And by that announcement, Sviatlana Cichanouskajos clearly stated that she is ready and she will be the center for all the initiatives happening in and around Belarus. And in our opinion of ISANS as a think tank, this is the cooperation with Sviatlana Cichanouskajos and her office is the only scenario possible for successful and peaceful transit of power in Belarus. We believe that there are four basic scenarios which are based on such factors as external subjects of politics, internal subjects, as well as a mixture of those. That includes repressions, the activity of people inside Belarus, and very briefly, the four main actors that are now engaged in this conflict situation or in this transit situation, as we might call it. These are the supporters of Sviatlana Cichanouskajos, the supporters of Alexander Lukashenko on the other side, Russian Federation and its allies within CSTO and other related organizations, and the collective West, which includes the European Union, NATO, and other organizations. There are four basic scenarios which we believe can be a potential future for Belarus. The first scenario, which we call the standoff or position war, is pretty much something that we observed in the previous few months when there was a relative parity between the protesters and the law enforcement agencies, if we might call them this way. So under this standoff scenario, we believe that Russia will continue to involve Belarus into what might be considered as soft annexation, which pretty much moves at the moment, and the factors of Russian engagement in the Belarusian conflict give a hint that Russia has not abandoned its idea of deep integration with Belarus, as they call it. And for as long as the West will remain or might remain passive on that situation, Russia will increase its influence on Belarus despite protest activity, because it will be a lot easier for Lukashenko to deal with the protesters if they do not have support from the global community and if Russia supports Alexander Lukashenko, although he does not have neither legitimacy, not legal status as the leader of state, and has issues with financing the work of the country. Russia will be ready to fund him. So in that case, if the standoff will continue, which is not the case at the moment, Russia could have increased its influence on Belarus and arranged the scenario of this soft integration, of soft annexation. The other scenario is the final push, as we call it. Within this scenario, we believe that if the government will increase the repressions and the protesters will give up, which is unlikely at the moment, Russia might be more pushy on Lukashenko in terms of deep integration projects. However, Lukashenko might be more resilient to their offers, since he will have a feeling that by increasing repressions and cutting the head of the protests, he gets the control over the country. If this is the scenario for the reality, we will see more isolation on the behalf of Belarus, not just from the West, but also from Russia either, in Lukashenko's effort to avoid more influence of Russia on the internal political situation, because he will do everything possible to maintain control in his hands. The third scenario is something that we call dramatic emancipation. Under this scenario, the repressions will continue and they will grow, but in response to repressions, we will observe even more activity from the side of the protesters in various options. As we see in the last few weeks, the protesters are changing their tactics from purely mass gatherings to various acts of public and civil disobedience, which make the authorities nervous, which make them flush finance to deal with both acts of disabilities and the results of the acts of civil disobedience, but also with the results of such acts. We assume that in case the violence will continue to grow, at a certain point, the violence will become so unbearable for certain people inside the system that it might lead to coup against Lukashenko, but it will also make Belarus a sort of a gray zone of Europe, mainly because the people who would arrange the coup are pretty much the people with a background which is similar to Lukashenko and his people. So in that case, we will see even more isolation than in scenario 2, but also more violence inside the country. The fourth scenario, which we call cohesion to national dialogue and peace, is a scenario under which a common effort of the protesters, the global community, and Russia, which will be coerced by the global community to stop financing Lukashenko's regime, will lead to his resignation from the presidential post. There, however, might be the outcome, which is still likely, when certain portions of state property, such as large factories, including the dairy industry, the oil refineries, Belarus Kali, the biggest producer of potash in Belarus and one of the greatest in the world, might be sold out through offshore companies belonging to Lukashenko's clan, as we might call it. And after the clan and the core people will leave Belarus, they will still maintain control over these companies. It will be the financial control purely. It might not be legitimate control, but still it might, even if the transition will happen, this control of major factories may be a significant trouble for new transition government. So in order to prevent these, there has to be a clear mechanism, which is pretty much described by the findings of the report of Professor Benedek, the report of OSCE Moscow mechanism that was published just recently. And it provides a clear set of recommendations that will lead to more pressure on the law enforcement of Belarus, but also on the civil administration, which still remains pretty much loyal to Lukashenko. It's not a great portion of the society, but it's still a great portion of administrative power, which still remains in the hands of people loyal to the self-declared president. One of the instruments that was suggested by Professor Benedek is legal persecution of people responsible for atrocities. And this is where Lithuania is currently one of the leaders globally. And as Lithuania's foreign minister suggested, other countries of the European Union and what we might call the collective West should follow this practice, and they should start new criminal cases against Belarusian law enforcement, against Belarusian civil administration representatives who are responsible for such crimes as torture, such crimes as arbitrary arrests. There's been more than 30,000 people detained on political reasons. There's more than 160 political prisoners in the country, which makes Belarus one of the leaders globally. And all of those crimes are regarded as gross human rights violations, which means universal jurisdiction can be applied to those cases. This is the legal way to put more pressure on the administration yet loyal to Alexander Lukashenko. Another important tool that was suggested by Western countries and Poland in particular, and was supported by the greater EU, is the so-called Marshall Plan for Belarus, which will help countries sustain transformation and will help country go smoothly through the process of economic reforms after the regime will collapse as a result of peaceful transformation and as a peaceful transit of power, which is the most desirable option at the moment, particularly because of its stability and because of the threats that all other scenarios possess and can impose on other countries of the region. As was stated by the US ambassador to OSCE, the behavior of Belarusian civil administration and law enforcement is threatening the basic security of all OSCE member states, including the United States, including Lithuania and Poland and other countries. This situation has to be seen not just as a peaceful revolution happening in one country, but also as a matter of stability of the whole European region. Additionally, considering the nuclear threat that current instability in Belarus can impose on countries like Lithuania.
Thank you, Sergei, for such an prompt presentation of your paper and possible scenarios. So before giving the floor to Mr. Dabravolski, could you just confirm for us that actually the major actors which you analyzed, Russia is the most important in for the development of any kind of the scenarios in Belarus?
I wouldn't say it's the most important. The most important factor is actually a combination of factors. It's the activity of passive behavior of all four, including the forces loyal to Alexander Lukashenko, the population of Belarus, which is already a subject in politics, unlike previously, the actions or passive behavior of the collective West, and the actions or the passive behavior of Russia. So there was a long-standing perception that Russia is the only actor that can influence Belarus. However, in given circumstances, when there's clear observation that Alexander Lukashenko completely lost his internal, I'm not talking about external, I'm talking about internal legitimacy. He is the person who is not supported by the majority or half of the population, or not even 30% of the population. It has to be clearly understood that no practice of Finlandization towards Belarus is possible anymore. There was a perception that Russia was the only actor who has the vote and who has to say the last word on the conflict in Belarus. But today there are two other actors that can really influence the situation. And as we see from the acts of the United States, the activity of the European Union, the countries like Lithuania and Poland, there's definitely a desire and political will in this country to tear down Alexander Lukashenko and to get rid of him as a person who manages politics in Eastern Europe. So I would say that it's not for Russia to decide, it's for the people of Belarus to decide, and it's for them to solve the issue. Also, a very important matter within these protests is that they were not targeting pro-Western or pro-Russian way of development of Belarus. It's a purely internal situation. It's a purely internal fight between the people who want have their right to vote, who want their political rights back, and who still have the same 5 demands that they had before the elections, and some of them were added after the elections, after the brutality that people witnessed from the law enforcement. But the 5 demands were the following. It was the unconditional resignation of Alexander Lukashenko, new elections conducted in compliance with the international standards and in presence of international observers, suspension of all violence against the peaceful protesters, investigation and prosecutors of those responsible for atrocities, and release of all political prisoners. None of these points were yet faced by the administration of the self-declared president of Belarus, by which I mean Lukashenko. And moreover, there's certain imitation that he is now willing to present to the West again and again, as it has been for 26 years, and it's not just for the West, but also for Russia, that there's certain constitutional reform and that there's a certain democratic dialogue and roundtable happening in Belarus. No dialogue and no roundtable is happening until there are political prisoners and until former candidates are forced out of country and until some of them are in KGB prison in the center of Minsk.
Thank you, Mr. Kharytonau. Now I turn to Alexander Dabravolski. As I mentioned, he's a senior advisor to Sviatlana Cichanouskajos, and some of the elements have already been mentioned, and I saw them in the scenarios you described, and we are really very keen to hear your insights, actually. From the really taking into account the external actors to what kind of scenarios can happen really on the ground, looking not only from the strategic, but from the tactical perspectives as well. Please, Mr. Dabravolski, the floor is yours.
I'd like to say thank you very much for invitation. And thanks, Sergei, for your presentation, because it's very interesting, and it's sometimes, as I feel, very similar to my perception of the situation. Let's start that Belarus is now in a situation of acute political crisis, and to discuss scenarios, we should understand what is the reason of the crisis. In my opinion, the reason is the only one problem. Mr. Lukashenko have lost the elections, but he is not ready to step out. So, and people are not ready to have such a president as Lukashenko. They are strongly against him. So, understanding that, we can take into account what scenarios are stable or sustainable, and what scenarios are not sustainable. In my paper, unfortunately, it was not enough time to translate it into English for me. In my paper, there are 6 scenarios, but they are almost similar with scenarios about what Sergei have told about. The first scenario, it was the 4th in Sergei presentation, is scenario of new elections as a result of negotiations. We feel that it's still possible that Lukashenko will decide to start negotiations with opposition, with protesters. And it's one option. The second option of this scenario is when some group of high-level officials will decide to start negotiations without Lukashenko. It's possible as well. This scenario, in my opinion, is sustainable because it will resolve the main problem of the situation. It leads to new elections. New elections, it's a resolving of all problems, and it's resolving of main problem, legitimacy of the power. The second scenario is similar to the first. New elections as a result of the fact that office of president is empty, is vacant. Option one of this scenario is in case when a president leaves the country. Option two, that president resigns. And option three, when it will be possible when the past president will be arrested. We see that in this situation, maybe we can count on a round table as a means of negotiations about conditions of new elections, or Sviatlana Cichanouskajos takes the office as acting president. The third scenario is tightening of the regime. Sergei told about this possibility. We think that this scenario is not sustainable because there are not enough resources to make a regime sustainable. The fourth scenario is about Russia's activity when Russia introduced military and police units to Belarus, and it may be incorporation of Belarus and Russia into Russia or not, but this is a scenario. We think it's also unstable because there are not enough resources even in Russia to make sustainable this configuration between Russia and Belarus. Of course, Lukashenko wants to make situation longer. He told about constitutional reform and hoped to that protests will subside. It's possible. It's a fifth scenario, but we think it's as well unstable because he, of course, have not enough resources to make this regime stable. And the sixth scenario is coup d'etat. It's possible, but we don't see any reasons for that. But it's unfortunately it's possible because in this situation we see that every party is not. It's not this today's situation is not acceptable for any party, for regime, for opposition, and this unstable situation may lead to coup d'etat. It may be military or nomenclatura coup d'etat, but this scenario is also is not also sustainable, because it possibly leads to scenario 1, negotiations and then elections, or a vacancy of office of president. So I think that there are two scenarios that are sustainable, and the first and the second, and they are sustainable because they resolve the main reason of the crisis, illegitimacy of the power. Only scenarios when new elections will be conducted are sustainable, in my opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dabravolski. As it goes in Russian, мы знаем, кто виноват, но что делать? We know who is guilty, but what to do? In the two most sustainable scenarios, what you would name as the main or most required action, be it from Svetlana and your team, or be it from their other actors around the international organizations as well other countries?
Our strategy is pressure, negotiations, new elections. We hope that it will be successful. It was not successful enough so far, but we see that Lukashenko legitimacy is a big problem, and only Russia, maybe China, but we are not sure, maybe count on legitimacy of Lukashenko, but most countries in the world are not recognized Lukashenko as a winner of the presidential elections. And at the same time, we have a legitimacy of political legitimacy of Sviatlanos Cichanouskajos inside Belarus and outside Belarus. So our strategy works, but not enough. And we think that we should continue our protests and our pressure. We count on pressure of international community, and we count on sanctions against repressions in Belarus. And we see that it leads to negotiations and to new elections. I think that interference of Russia, it's dangerous for Belarus, but as Sergei said already, it's clearly internal affair in Belarus. Our crisis is about political will of our citizens, but not geopolitical or something else. So we count on solidarity of the world, and we count on our society.
Thank you. I have a question for both of the panelists. Both of you actually mentioned and had either direct or between the lines that which scenarios could be most sustainable. But can you actually openly say which scenarios are most likely, or which one of the scenarios is most likely? Maybe now we will start with Sergei.
Well, I would say at the moment we're observing a scenario in which Alexander Lukashenko is not willing to engage in any kind of discussion, and what he's doing is trying to get a bit more time to think of the ways to increase his legitimacy. Although at the moment, there seems like there will be no economical miracle. There will be no good rationale presented by him and his team. There will be no new vision. All the instruments and all the recommendations that are being offered at the table are more archaic than they were in times of his presidency, which ended in November this year. So I would say that the most likely scenario at the moment would be the continuation of pressure on him by the international community, which is very notable. The OEC is having very strict position towards Belarus. The United States have very strict position. Lithuania and Poland are very proactive in promoting the steps that are later being followed by the rest of Western countries, which is a great opportunity for Russian society, because Lithuania has become, along with Poland, sort of the diplomats of Belarusian president-elect in Europe. Since these countries know the specifics of the Belarusian politics better than, let's say, France or Portugal, it's logical that these countries are making the first steps that are later being followed by other EU countries. I would say that it yet seems unlikely that the protesters will increase violence. However, violence might be increased in response to the state violence, which is very likely. So I would say that as long as there's common pressure from the collective West and the protesters, and there's extra pressure set up on the Russian Federation, for whom Lukashenko is pretty much a very toxic object to possess. It's really hard to keep him in Belarus, and Russian Federation and the Kremlin in particular yet have no clear vision of what to do with Lukashenko. And this is probably one of the reasons why he himself is searching for these new old ways to maintain power, like the All Belarusian People's Assembly that he wants to transform into a constitutional institution, which is completely illogical, because in fact, these are the people that were set up by him personally as heads of state enterprises, as heads of ministries and other civil administration structures. So he is seeking to build up a sort of KPSS 2.0 and the Politburo, in which he will be the leader for a certain time. Probably because he does not have enough information. He does not have clear understanding that he lost completely, that the loss that happened in the elections was absolutely destroying for his legitimacy. Maybe some people in the presidential administration still do not believe in this. Maybe they do not have enough information, reliable information provided by state security. I'm not the right person to say whether it is really so, but the acts that they do are leading to more and more new mistakes. And as Mr. Dabravolski just said very correctly, the situation of the stalemate, which we are observing now, is very, very not profitable for everyone. It's tiring for everyone, and it's extremely tiring for the state administration, for financial system, for the economy. The more the situation will unfold, the worse it will be for the people who were the supporters of Alexander Lukashenko at a certain point, because all of the system of statecraft that he has been building in 26 years is collapsing, and it's very notable. The general public does not have belief in institutions. They do not have support for the institutions. They are not willing to somehow engage into cooperation with state institutions, which means that the so-called internal ghetto, which existed for the opposition activists within the last 25 years, 26 years, is now a formula which actually describes the existence of the civil administration run by Lukashenko. This is where the internal ghetto is now. This is not the power. This is actually the opposition in Belarus today, because of the numbers. They are outnumbered by the majority of the population, which means that At a certain point, within, if not weeks, then months, these people would finally realize that they have no support. The state television does not have people to talk in support of Lukashenko, and they are showing the same people in various situations who are explaining their support to the regime, but they cannot find people among the general public in the streets to say, yes, I openly support the former president of Belarus, because there is no support for this person anymore. So I believe that the case of peaceful transformation and peaceful transit is very likely, but for this it requires the pressure on the civil administration and law enforcement, who in turn will keep losing their loyalty to the person who is actually the core of the problem, who is actually the person who built the whole crisis, and the crisis will end up immediately. There will be certain constraints, there will be certain difficulties that the society will have to get over. It might take years, but in order to start this real dialogue, which never existed since I remember myself, I was born in 1989, Lukashenko became the president in 1994. There's a generation of people who have never seen any other form of government, who have never seen any other form of state media, who never observed public media as they are understood here in the Western world, which means that the society will step on a long path of transformations, which might take years, as I said, which actually happened to countries like Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. But overall, let's say, in one generation of the Belarusian citizens, we'll be able to see a country developing really fast because of the bottom line, which the country is in at the moment, and because of the solidarity, which is unprecedented in Belarusian society. Nothing like that happened in the early 90s. And the efforts of both internal population and diaspora are just miraculous. And I would say that the greatest mistake that the regime does at the moment is that they try to divide people, and they divide their own supporters. They say, people abroad are not the ones that we want. These doctors are not the ones that we want. Cichanouskajos says, I'm glad to work with everyone. All of these people are my people. This is all of my Belarusian nation. And I'm ready to talk to anyone. I'm ready to bring anyone in the team if these people are the ones who wish the best to the country. If they're willing to engage into peaceful dialogue, I'm ready to bring them into my team. And that's the greatest effort that she did. She actually took over the greatest obstacle of all previous social movements in Belarus. There were repressions previously. There were collections of signatures for opposition candidates previously. But the only thing that never existed is a candidate who represents everyone, a candidate of unity. And she became...
Yes. Thank you, Sergei. I think that you will not leave to Alexander anything to add. He's a senior advisor to Sviatlanos Cichanouskajos, and maybe just a couple of words, because Sergei talked a lot about the most likely scenario. You mentioned the most sustainable scenarios. We have the question from the several questions from the audience, and one is actually about the stalemate. Both of you actually talked about, and the question goes: the longer the current stalemate continues, the higher is possibility of Belarus becoming a failed state, no economy, no effective government, and as there is no possibility for Lukashenko to return to business as usual. He has nothing to lose, everything or nothing. Even if he disappears at the end of the day, new leadership will face a huge problem with Belarus statehood as such. Transnistria or Donbass looks very realistic. How to avoid that? Alexander, have you discussed with the opposition leader, with the Belarusian people's leader, Sviatlanos Cichanouskajos, how to avoid this Belarus turning into Transnistria?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your questions. I'd like to ask the first question. Sergei have said almost everything, but I will add a little bit. Of course, Lukashenko will try to drag out the time, but the sense of his power for more than 20 years was the same, to prevent the future. So we have such a Soviet-style, retro-style state now in Belarus. And I believe that there are not enough resources all around the world to prevent the future. It will fail. This project have already failed, and Lukashenko is not able anymore to make his situation stable. And of course, we understand that new authorities in Belarus will face great problems. But let's imagine, let's see outside Lukashenko's office. There are many people in the government. And I'm sure that most of them are very qualified and are ready to solve all main problems of the state. We know that there are many good economists, lawyers, and other specialists in Belarus to solve our problems. The main problem was that initiative of people was not welcomed in our country, but loyalty was welcomed. So if we will change that situation and ask people to be active, we will solve all our problems. Of course, it will not easy. It will be hard, but it's only our way to change our situation.
Thank you. We have actually two questions related to Belarus-Russian relation, because you know, the thing is that, of course, a lot of big part of Belarusian future lies in people's hands, but we do understand that the other actors around, be it neighboring countries or be it international organizations, especially international financial organizations, would play a huge role in any kind of scenario. But on the other hand, we have Russia, who actually is not really very much interested in Belarusian success, as it is not interested in Ukrainian success or any other country around it. And there's the question of Mr. Laurynas Janavičius asking that Russia has a big interest in Transnistria scenario in Belarus, and we have the question from Mr. Albertas Dabkus, who is as well asking which is actually more likely Belarusian Russian interest in relations based, interest based or value based. Do you think Russia, what kind of the role Russia can play in the development of any of those scenarios you were mentioning?
I think that the role of Russia will be very important anyway in any scenario. Of course, Russia can decide to interfere or not to interfere into Belarus situation, but let's see to the future. Any government in Belarus should take into account that Russia is the closest neighbor, that Russia has interests that are not every time good for Belarus, but we count on help of international community to preserve our sovereignty, and we count on help of international financial structures to support our country, to make our economy stable in the first period just before the new elections and just after the elections. So it's a hard task to preserve our sovereignty and to build good relations with Russia, but this task will be very important in any scenario. I'm not sure that it will be easy, but we should do it.
The thing that's surprised, and maybe it should not surprise actually, was that just after the elections, the second or third week, there's some European leaders tried to call actually Alexander Lukashenko, and he refused the call for Angela Merkel, and as far as I know from some other leaders, and he actually gave the floor to Mr. Putin to talk on behalf of him. I'm not sure if actually it gives a lot of credit to Lukashenko himself, but definitely it's not my task here to decide on him. But it speaks for the fact speaks for itself. There is another very interesting question we haven't touched actually. In our discussion, maybe then Sergei, but shortly, and then Alexander can reply to that. Mr. Egidius Vareikis, our former member of Parliament, as well as a foreign policy analyst, notes that world has pandemics. It influences all areas of politics. And in the papers, in your papers, pandemics looks like a minor factor of current events. Is pandemic really a fact that helps current regime, or it's a weapon on your side? Asks Egidius Vareikis. I do as well believe that actually in the beginning it was really a huge factor, and now. Today or yesterday, regime announced that it will close the borders. Mm-hmm. So that means that people who will try to flee even the repressions of regime will be captured inside the country. So, but please, I promise the organizers that we will finish on time. That means in 5 minutes. So please be sharp in your answers, so then we can wrap up the discussion after your question.
Thank you,
Sergei.
Very short. I have a very short comment on the previous question. We already discussed this situation with Russia inside ISAN's group, and according to our information, the reason Lukashenko did not pick up the phone was one of the conditions of Vladimir Putin personally, as Russia will solve the problem and Lukashenko has nothing to do with this. I would say that the reality of forced intervention, like the physical intervention, is something that we witnessed in the Crimea, is extremely low. It's a bit higher than for Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, but it's still extremely low, primarily because of the price for Russia. Secondly, because of anti-military moods inside Russia that such intervention might call. And thirdly, Russia does not want an open military conflict 450 kilometers away from Moscow, Russia's capital, on a plain territory. Coming back to the question that you've asked, yes, the pandemic was one of the main issues with these protests, and it was one of the main reasons people were so actively participating in democratic processes before the elections and in the process of elections, because they've realized that the government does not care about them, and that the people can do certain functions, can perform certain functions of the government actually better than the government does. So I would say it yet remains an important factor, but it's not as important as it was in the very beginning. It was extremely important in the beginning. Now people are getting used to the idea that the coronavirus is here. Yes, the official results are a lot higher than they were. The second wave hits Belarus a lot harder than it was previously. But now the core emotional reason and rationale behind the protest is not the coronavirus, it's the violence of the state police, because the coronavirus cannot kill you at home. The coronavirus cannot break into your apartment and beat you there to death. So that's the reason why people are so engaged, and that's the reason why people are so willing to participate in the protest. They want to get rid of violence, and they want to avoid people from breaking into their houses and beating them there, and from throwing them into prison.
Thank you, Alexander.
I think that sometimes I hear that coronavirus and pandemic were the reason of our protest. I'm not sure. I don't agree. I think reasons are deeper. Coronavirus was one of triggers of our protests. And I remember when Lukashenko said that there are no any coronavirus, it's only a psychological problem. In our society was created such an initiative by COVID-19 by public institutions and public leaders, and they become to help doctors and hospitals, and it was very strong public initiative when state was resigned in situation of pandemic. So and now I think power tries to use this pandemic to close borders, but nobody believes that it's a reason for closing borders. Everybody understands that it's only political reasons to close borders. I think now it's our environment, this pandemic, for our revolution.
Thank you very much for your answers. And before closing our discussion, I would actually can quote one of the, maybe not the questions, but the comments of our listener, Mr. Yuri Jibladze, who actually says that we don't believe in the facade of imitation of reforms and dialogue. What matters right now is forces and resources, cutting cash, weakening support base for the regime, and supporting spirit and well-being of protesters. I do believe he asked if the current international measures are sufficient. I think that we all have our answers, and the panelists actually quite broadly answered to the question that, you know, we need more, you need more, Belarus need more, and to ensure the sustainable scenario, not the most likely, but sustainable scenario. I think that both panelists actually mentioned three major things. What is needed right now is stop repression, new elections, and release of the prisoners. I think this sums up our discussion about the scenarios. If it goes like this, in this way, then we can actually see independent, free and democratic Belarus with a true leader, people elected by people. Thank you very much for the discussion. And before the closing discussion, Virginia, would you like to make a final comment on the behalf of the organizers?
On the behalf of Vilniaus Institute for Policy Analysis, thank you, the panelists, Siarhei and Alexander, and thank you, Jovita Neliupšienė, for moderation. And I also want to remind all the attendees that the policy paper from Siarhei can be found on the website of Vilniaus Institute for Policy Analysis. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for the audience who actually was with us, more than 80 people. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.